How to fight Christian nationalism and how to fight the Christian right. If you're a left-winger, and if anything I say doesn't apply to you, I apologize in advance. I'm anything but a social conservative. To name a few things, I'm against authoritarian parenting, authoritarian schooling, circumcision, bans on pornography, bans on prostitution, bans on drugs, corporal punishment, and school uniforms and dress codes. I support youth rights, animal welfare, and equality for queers. I also support right to repair along with free and open source software such as Linux and the Google Android. Even if you disagree with me, please take what I'm saying in good faith, even if I do turn out to be wrong. Likewise, if you're going to try to dishonestly twist my arguments into something I wasn't saying, take me out of context and the like, or dishonorably tear me down, you're just proving why your arguments aren't strong enough to face me directly, and you're only showing your own morally degraded state. When the debate is lost, slander becomes a tool for the user. Anonymous.
Number 11. Purposely misunderstanding people is okay. One of the things that drives me absolutely insane in debates is when I put a major point across and then the other person just nitpicks a bunch of minor details without touching the core point of the argument. It's depressing to see great men often get torn down for minor things they would have scarcely thought about and not considered for their greatest achievements. Sigmund Freud is mocked for penis envy and the Oedipal complex rather than figuring out the underlying basis of modern psychology and the unconscious. An alternate figure, whether you love him or hate him, is Jordan Peterson, who is criticized for his comments on transgender people, while the entire pseudo-religion he's constructed based off Jungian psychology is completely ignored. This is since our minds are inherently irrational, and if we dislike someone, since it's against our self-interest somehow, we look for reasons no matter how petty to do so, and since we don't want to come to terms with their core beliefs, we purposely misunderstand by nitpicking and trying to cut things in a lot of little ways. This may sound like a minor thing, but it's actually a massive factor in tearing down successful interactions and people. The way you prevent big things from happening is by heckling them. Look at countries like Italy or Spain, which have ground their economies to standstills, with lots of regulations. If you're a teacher, the best way to discourage a student from being brilliant is by cutting them down by grading them too harshly for spelling mistakes. Society is built on cooperation, and we can either structure it to be a negative force for criticism and belittlement, or a positive one for encouragement and positive growth. Negative examples of this include stranger danger, systems in which children were encouraged to view all strangers as dangerous, which resulted in a generation of isolated, unsocial, and lonely people. Alternatively, academia's immense insistence upon exactness, which cuts down genius and works of broad scope. We need to structure society with hope rather than fear, growth rather than littleness in mind. Number 8. Information can be harmful. Nietzsche once said you can judge a man by how much truth they can handle. The truth is that the truth is the ultimate arbiter of existence. Having an understanding of how things work is the most important part of doing anything. You can't be hurt by knowing information, since knowing the truth is just knowing what you'd already have to deal with anyway. Knowing that a hurricane is coming your way might lead to short-term stress, but it will allow you to prepare for said hurricane. However, across history and the world today, you see that regimes and ideologies try to shut off the supply of information, saying it will hurt the public. The truth, however, is just that information hurts these regimes and their power. I remember an amusing anecdote of how Catholic authorities in France were burning Bibles during the Reformation, for fear that people would, upon reading them, become Protestant, to which my reaction is, wouldn't you realize you're the one at fault upon realizing that the appropriate reaction to reading your source material is that you're wrong? When someone tries to hide information, it means that they know they're on the losing side of the argument but want to keep power. This is true between Tokugawa shogunate Japan, Stalinist Russia, or Inquisition Spain. You can always tell who the bad guys are based off those who vilify the truth and tell you should support party thinking above it. There's a difference between this and the addiction models that come with modern social media, however. When an already beautiful model with Photoshop and filters makes women feel insecure, they're not getting information, they're getting propaganda of something that isn't real. Similarly, social media apps are designed to be inherently addictive. As an inverse to information, propaganda is inherently harmful. The low degree of trust in societies in the modern world is likely a result of the massive propaganda campaigns of the world wars that all out lied to their populations. Similarly, although I think they're evil, I do understand why authorities want to keep their stories about the world and filter out competing information, because said stories are how societies work, and by degrading the common myths of societies, you degrade cooperation. However, I think what people should do is edit their stories so that they can fit into new information. And that's difficult, but I think it has to be done. And also, to be truthful, I do draw an exception. Judgment attached. Number 2. Intentions equals results. Okay, so self-interest isn't everything, but it's very easy to do the opposite and act like goodwill is the only important thing. This in turn can create incredible problems when scaled. Giving people who want to do good too much power is how millions of people have died across history. This always becomes a problem when too many people with power agree that they're right and think that opposing their intentions makes other people inherently evil. Across history, religious fanatics have done this a lot, and today the left is by far the group that's most guilty of it. Take the social justice insistence upon defund the police. This comes from a good-meaning leftist outrage that stems from police forces often actually being corrupt and mistreating black ghetto communities often like colonies. In real terms, however, the actual amount of unarmed black men who are shot by the police is statistically very small. The real effects of lessening police influence in black communities and replacing them with social workers who have an extremely bad track record in improving said communities is a skyrocketing rate of black gun deaths, since the vast majority of black people who are killed are by other black people. Statistically, police presence markedly lowers the murder rate, and so defund the police has actually ended up killing far more black people than it saved. We've seen a 1/3 rise in homicide rates since 2020. The cardinal sin of left-wing philosophy is that it believes that people with good intentions are more important on a macro scale than incentive structures. Left-wingers believe that having the right opinions that brings them to utopia makes them good people, rather than actually moral actions, which is why communists have always been willing to kill millions to reach their utopias. For example, left-wingers often think right-wingers are evil since they think the right-wingers are willfully against progress, while the right-wingers often think left-wing policies just don't work. This obsession with intentions has often forced left-wingers into echo chambers, which dislodge them from reality, which has resulted in legitimately evil consequences, caused by people who wish the best. Communism in a 60-year period killed almost as many people as every other religion and ideology combined across the whole of human history. Something really important is that if you sacralize a social group for having good intentions, it will actively attract the most evil and unscrupulous people who will want to use the goodwill as a cover for bad actions. This is why the Catholic Church attracted pedophiles, communist movements the worst tyrants of all time, or religious fanatics have often blatantly broke the tenets of the religions they hold so dear. A great example of incentive structures working in weird ways is that the British Raja in India wanted to lower the snake population, and so gave cash prizes to people who would bring them dead snakes. This in turn resulted in people breeding snakes and killing them in order to bring them to authorities for a cash prize. The British realized this and got rid of the cash prize, which resulted in the snake breeders releasing their snakes into the streets, which just made the problem worse. The key point to consider here is that our brains were designed to deal with small hunter-gatherer communities. People's brains tend to be on a spectrum between logic thing-based and people-feeling-based. The people-feeling part of our brain tends to be better at in-person small-scale communications. If your cousin makes a mistake but his intentions are good, you should forgive him. However, once you scale to millions of people, you need to view things logically and abstractly. The problem is that when people try to make political decisions to show their morality to become popular inside their own moral structure, whether in Soviet Russia, medieval China, or 16th century Spain. This is my problem with isms, like globalism, capitalism, communism, etc., since when you start treating political positions like religions that demand loyalty, rather than tools to help your nation prosper, you're going to run into this problem eventually. An attachment to this is the cult of authenticity, in which lots of people today basically believe that the way to be true and moral is to be as purely authentic to yourself as possible. And in a lot of ways that's true, or if you try to copy someone else too much, or act in a way that doesn't make you happy, it's going to make you fundamentally miserable, and you're going to fail at playing games that other people are naturally more attuned to. At the same time, you need to learn from other people and balance out your own weaknesses. So if you're a nerd, learn to be more charismatic and presentable. If you're a jock, learn to be more wise. Or if you're a goth, don't wear your black makeup into the workforce. Cannibalism's authentic to New Guinean tribes, and I don't think that fundamentally makes it okay. But at the same time, I don't think countries should throw away their individuality and enter into the world's McDonaldization.
And the leftist, instead of, say, talking to these people, understanding them, convincing them, converting them, these pro-choice people who should have been positive advocates for their position, who should have stuck by that bodily autonomy principle. Instead, they shrieked at the top of their lungs, shout your abortion, subvert the system, smash the patriarchy, be as publicly immoral as possible. Did that convince the rightoids? Well, maybe only that they were correct to call you demons, along with driving away anybody who might have been on the fence too. If you want people to join your cause, and you should, you need to extend a hand to them. You are asking them to move to your position, but that means that the burden is on you to ease them into it. You have to give them a lifeline that, in their own time, they can use to pull themselves into your camp. If all you do is screech and shout about how they're bigots for not immediately thinking like you, becoming a copy of you, they're just not going to join you. But that is the bed that the left has made. The left wanted it all, and they openly violated all of their stated principles to get it. Bodily autonomy used to be a concrete stance, something that you could really plant a flag on. It was my body, my choice, not my body, my choice, terms and conditions apply. And unfortunately, when the left violated that principle during COVID, they lost the support of anybody who considered hypocrisy to be disgusting. And that is the majority of people. The end result will be that, in their pursuit of everything, the left is quite likely to get nothing at all.
Would you rather have someone agree with you 10% of the time, or 50% of the time? If you can partially change someone's mind, take that as a small victory. Appealing to your opponent's values can work better than preaching or screaming your own values at them. If I was to talk to a left-winger, I appeal to their values of empathy, compassion, wishing to help oppressed peoples, hatred for corporacy and corruption, and so on. If I was to talk to a right-winger, I'd appeal to their values of law and order, strength, unity, and so on. Like what Shady Durag said in King of the Hill, the one where they go to Japan, if you're talking to a logos guy, ethos and pathos aren't going to work. Summarizing part of what Shady Durag said in King of the Hill, the one where they go to Japan, what happens is that Cotton gets angry at Junichiro for rejecting him and goes on a rampage. Hank needed Junichiro's help to find Father Cotton. And realizing that Junichiro didn't care about the same things as him, Hank appeals to something Junichiro does care about, his honor, to convince him to help find Cotton. I wish people would practice more of what I call values empathy, which is understanding and appealing to what other people value, instead of merely preaching what they themselves value. Like the saying goes, you attract more flies with honey than vinegar. I'd say that left-wingers are, on average, more empathetic than right-wingers, but the specific type of empathy is emotional empathy, not values empathy. Is screaming at your opponent for disagreeing with you on X issue really that different from a right-wing Christian calling you an immoral, sinning heathen? I have Asperger's syndrome and schizoid personality disorder, and I have more empathy than that. When it comes to why you should treat your opponents like human beings, look at Dale Davis, who got some 200 plus individuals to leave the Ku Klux Klan. Davis shows that it doesn't require genius intellect or even expert knowledge, like a psychologist or sociologist, to change people's minds. He's a reasonable man who's a musician who made friends with and reasoned with people, presenting arguments that they haven't heard before or looking at issues from different angles. His attitude is even better than mine. 200 doesn't sound like much, but I consider it an accomplishment to change the mind of one person, so 200 is realistically a lot for one person. Contrary to popular belief, even racists make exceptions, so it's not a stretch to think that anti-atheists or other faithists could make exceptions. 5 Things I Learned as a Neo-Nazi by J.F. Sargent, Frank Meeting. Davis has also stated that it actually takes longer to get people to leave the Klan if they joined out of family tradition rather than racial animosity. I've seen many left-wing atheists preach about how great Scandinavia is. That just doesn't work. Right-wingers, and especially the Christian right, do not value the same things as you do. You value comfort and equality. They value strength, unity, and order. Left-wingers tend to be like Rousseau, having an optimistic view of man as being naturally good and are made bad by institutions, while right-wingers tend to be like Hobbes, having a pessimistic view of man as being naturally evil and need institutions, structure, and hierarchy to not commit bad actions. Treating your opponents like people who have legitimate concerns is more effective than screaming at them. Censorship does not work. If anything, censorship increases polarization and radicalism. Also, censoring moderate voices and leaving up extreme strawmen can turn your strawman into a monster. A case study of this is Nick Fuentes and Ryan Dawson. Fuentes went from a small-time streamer to becoming a household name and meeting Kanye West. Dawson, by contrast, was censored more heavily and is still unknown to the world. Ryan Dawson has debated racists and has stated that approximately a third of his audience, hence of his debates of racists, has had their minds changed. He has even moved David Duke towards the center and away from racial determinism. Whenever you deal with your opponent's ideas, 1. Have humility. Be humble. You do not, and cannot know everything. Be open to being wrong and to changing your views and policies if you're wrong. 2. Look for information and views that differ from your own. 3. Falsify your own positions. This is how Ryan Dawson is so good at making arguments and avoids nonsense. I remember a video in which he stated that he debates his opponents in his head until his points can't be refuted. Create a steelman / strongman argument, which you argue against the best / strongest version of your opponent's ideas. If you can't imagine how your opponent's ideas could work, or you think your opponent's ideas are absurd, then you're probably strawmanning them. Think of your opponents as good people who want to solve the same problems as you do, but have different solutions, not as people who don't care, especially regarding don't care or even malicious, especially regarding economics and welfare. For example, if a progressive was to advocate for government to build and maintain roads, it would be a straw man for anarcho-capitalists to say that said progressive wanted the government to implement Stalinist collectivization and control every little piece of the economy down to lemonade stands. On the same token, a left-winger shouldn't accuse libertarians and conservatives of not caring about the poor because they have different ideas about helping the poor. I know that the last paragraph was more about economic and social issues. Here's when this article mainly pertains to social issues, but you get the idea. How to talk politics and not get furious. 5 tips from thrown away voices. The alt-right and Christian right are predictable backlashes to social justice and bullying whites, Christians, and the like. Be grateful that I've listened to Christian right-wingers so you wouldn't have to. It was frustrating. It was not pleasant. It was no fun at all. Part 2. Your political psychology and sociology homework. Almost all the videos below are in the playlist how to fight Christian nationalism, and how to fight the Christian right. An open message to fellow atheists, understanding the right. Imagine my shock. The 7 emotions that push civilization. How to talk politics and not get furious. Born This Way by Jonathan Haidt. How disgust drives society, history, and the right. Why the right and left hate each other. America's 21st century. Golden Age Civil War. Who will win America's next civil war? A historian explains being Gen Z. Why modern dating is broken. Will the West experience a conservative demographic revolution? The Psychology of Human Action by Jeff Leskovar. Why do right-wingers support Putin in Russia or China? An addendum to What If Alt-Hists A Study of Decadence. An addendum to Ubersoys, Why So Many Right-Wingers Support Putin Against Ukraine. Understanding Tankies, Western Self-Loathing, and the Threat of Fifth Column in the Anti-War Movement, Anti-Imperialist Movement, and Alternate Media. The Enemy of My Enemy is My Friend. Part of the Problem, number 515, Ryan Dawson. Optional. An honest look at the alt-right, and Hollywood hates you unless you agree with them. How political opponents became enemies in the U.S. I'll also mention that social conservatives tend to be higher in trait conscientiousness, unlike social liberals who tend to be higher in trait openness. When it comes to what freedom is, here's an excerpt from The Conflicting Definitions of Freedom, America versus Europe and the World. Definition 1, self-actualization. This is the ancient, aristocratic, and often right-wing / social conservative definition of freedom. You are freest when you are your best self. For example, if you studied hard, worked out at the gym, watched your diet, cultivated food, and virtuous habits. This is you achieving self-actualization. This definition of freedom can be traced back to Aristotle and Friedrich Nietzsche. Many social conservatives argue that vices, such as pornography, prostitution, gambling, and drugs, prevent self-actualization. This goes in hand with social conservatives talking about virtue and their obsession with order. Definition 2, freedom from coercion. This is the classical liberal definition of freedom. You are free to walk down the street, but not make anyone else carry you down the street. Your freedom to throw punches ends where someone else's face begins. This definition of freedom can be traced back to John Locke, Herbert Spencer, and F.A. Hayek. This definition seems to be more popular among parts of the United States of America and maybe even the Czech Republic and Estonia. Definition 3, convenience, lack of personal responsibility and or lack of boundaries. I'm free to do whatever I want without boundaries. I'm free to make you carry me down the street. In the words of YouTube user Mad Robot, freedom is being unconstrained by responsibility, not having to worry about food, housing, education, transportation, healthcare, etc., not having to suffer the consequences of their own actions, playing the victim and blaming society or others for their own inadequacies. This definition of freedom is promoted by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Karl Marx, and Jacques Derrida. This is the leftist definition of freedom. To add to the points in Imagine My Shock and the 7 emotions that push civilization, anxiety, please get a hobby or at least an interest outside of politics and take breaks. Love her or hate her, Lauren Southern, while still a conservative, has tempered her views and tone after taking a year off from politics. Activism and politics are important, but they're not worth your sanity, and high-quality content is indefinitely better than high-quantity content. Unlike many other Zoomers, I don't let my politics take over my personality to the point of to becoming a political contrarian. I can define myself just fine. Hence, I don't need my opponents to define me. I know that some right-wingers would scoff and or roll their eyes at me writing that I like Amsterdam. My answer is that maybe you shouldn't spend in every waking hour of your life in politics or the culture war, and take time out of politics and the culture war and decompress some. The libertarian commentator Six Hexenhammer 666, who has a strong right-wing following, spends time living in Amsterdam and met his current wife there. Tom Woods, a boomer conservative turned libertarian, who is Catholic, by the way, likes New York City. My article, is America the most free country in the world? What's so great about America? In America versus Europe and the world. Also, I may say hate Disney as a company, but I don't feel the need to hate Zootopia or Turning Red. Yes, I'm a furry. I need escapism, as someone who's involved in the alternate media and knows how shitty the real world is. Though I'm still a pirate. I can compartmentalize between a work of art and its creator. Here's the emotions that I believe that each major political faction is driven by. Boomer Republicans: pride, fear, anxiety, disgust. Leftists: anxiety and envy. Christian right and alt-right: disgust, resentment, anxiety. Libertarians: pride and guilt. Boomer Americans believe in American exceptionalism. America's the greatest country in the world, god damn it, and that America has the right to be the policeman of the world. Pride: are afraid of Islamic terrorism, Islam taking over the world, Iran getting nuclear weapons, and China. Fear: hate social justice. Resentment: and hold socially conservative views, such as opposing comprehensive sex education and or supporting corporal punishment. Disgust. Libertarians don't lavishly follow authority. Pride: and never give in to shame easily nor follow the herd. Guilt. Christian right and alt-right people hold strongly socially conservative views. Disgust: hate social justice. Resentment: and are willing to give up freedom for stability and community. Anxiety. Leftists: well, read the articles. The system need a trick. Dr. Theodore John Kaczynski explains the psychology of leftists, over-socialization and surrogate activities, Psychology of Human Action by Jeff Lescovar, and How Envy Drives Society, History, and the Left. I'm particularly worried about Generation Z, and I don't share Cole Hastings' optimism about them. I think Rudyard Lynch, what if alt-hist, was correct when he says that Zoomers don't believe in freedom or anything except for the most fervent worship of the most ardent ideologies. Just look at all the young people who openly support authoritarianism and even totalitarianism. I think this is mostly driven by loneliness. Even for Christian nationalists, I think today's internet Christian nationalism is more of a hate boner for social justice than an organic Christian movement that was formed in a vacuum. To paraphrase what was said in A Historian Explains Being Gen Z, in history, despotism is often buttressed by social isolation and fragmentation. Freedom is maintained by strong individuals, communities, and values that keep despotisms at bay. Look at the absolutely unbelievable corruption in Latin America, where people often do not trust their own neighbors, with similar conditions in southern Italy. The entire continents of Africa and Asia. Tyrannies were driven by societies where people lived inside of clans and or tribes and rarely associated outside of their social networks. If we want our freedom to survive, we need to be able to stem this. The radicalism caused by loneliness is so bad that I'm seeing the rise of tankies and right-wing tankies. Do you think that a mentally healthy population would throw away the prosperous, free, and beautiful Western civilization for the world's biggest totalitarian shitholes, being China and Russia, Orwell's Eurasia and East Asia, reviving the Mongol Empire over some social disagreements? That's absolutely frightening to me, not to mention appalling. Sorry, outdated image. That's better. I really ask that you read Addendum to What a Fault Hist on Decadence, since it goes in depth about how bad political polarization is and how it's actually an existential threat to Western civilization and human rights, freedom, and dignity. A huge card that could end up helping the Chinese is the crisis of leadership that's currently happening in the West. The Western nations are now in a basically religious civil war between the right and the left, which consumes most of their population's excess energies. Much of the Western elite hates itself so much that it's incapable of acting effectively. If the West doesn't sort its social issues within the next 10 years, China wins. And incoherent elites have allowed nations which are materially much weaker to make huge gains. The Manchus were able to conquer China with 1/100th of China's population in the 17th century. Since Chinese society was so fractious at the time, a similar thing can be said of the British conquest of India, the Spanish conquest of the Aztec or Inca empires, or the Roman conquest of Greece. Is China the next world power? By what a fault hist. The Roman Empire is falling, and the Germanic barbarians are outside a city in southern France. The defenders don't provide any defenses and are, in fact, working with the barbarians against their local rivals, only to have their city sacked. It was incomprehensible that the barbarians could be a real threat after Rome had been strong for so long. It had been centuries since non-Roman threats had been in the area. A study of decadence, when societies commit suicide. Working with barbarians or domestic opponents sounds like something both Tankies and Nick Fuentes' followers would do if Russia was to invade Europe, which would be a modern-day barbarian invasion. Speaking of Russia, if you meet a right-wing Russia/Putin supporter, show them the article, an addendum to Stop Idolizing Russia by NFKRZ, and addressing Eli from Russia and Gonzalo Lira. Should the right support Putin in Russia? Should the alternate media support Putin in Russia? All the yelling about Trump in Russia is barking up the wrong tree. I make a better case than anyone as to why the world would be worse off if Russia was the world's superpower rather than America. Here are some videos from Christian Nationalists that I recommend to understand them. If anyone has better videos, articles, etc., please let me know. Should we support Christian Nationalism by Vince Dow? Why the left fears Christian nationalism, the case against secularism, and counterculture by Carson Wolf. As much as I fervently disagree with Carson Wolf, he does have a point towards the end of what the far right's victory in Europe means for us. Because when he said that, in a nutshell, the more chaos there is, the harder authoritarianism will be to bring order to a society that was previously too okay with chaos. A very common thing that you'll hear from Christian nationalists is that they feel highly antagonized, especially by the social justice faction of the left. I have a feeling that Catholic Christian right-wingers, and probably some Orthodox Christian right-wingers, identify as Catholic to be contrarian to leftists. They see left-wingers rejecting hierarchy, structure, and tradition, and to be as opposite as possible to them, these Christian right-wingers identify with the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church because they're looking for hierarchy, structure, and tradition, which largely comes from the Hobbesian view of man. I like to mention a couple of common misconceptions about right authoritarians. One is that neo-Nazis and the alt-right universally support Christianity. This isn't true. I have observed comments from both neo-Nazis and the alt-right where they dislike Christianity. Rather, they see paganism as a more European religion, when, well, Christianity is a foreign import. Dislike Christianity because of its Jewish roots, and or they simply don't like Christianity's ideas slash values. Another misconception about right authoritarians is that fascism requires religion. Imperial Japan, Chiang Kai-shek's China, Park Chung-hee's South Korea, and Singapore are all examples of right authoritarian regimes that were irreligious, or at least not religious in a way Westerners are familiar with. The belief that fascism requires religion comes from looking at right authoritarianism in the West, which tend to include Christianity, or at the minimum pays lip service to it, as part of maintaining or returning to tradition, and where this isn't the case in East Asia, where Christianity is a minority religion and doesn't permeate East Asian culture. Think of this like a meeting within a law enforcement, military, or intelligence organization to understand the people you'll be dealing with before going on a mission in the Republic of Pineland, or something like that. I'm starting to sound like life is a special operation. This content is not endorsed by the United States Department of Defense or United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. Barbarism. Part 3. Barbarism. How the right is more dangerous than the left. Oh, I forgot. A significant portion of you guys dislike both hierarchy and masculinity, or at least the police and military. This is far from the first time this kind of thing has happened. I'll use examples from 11th century China and India, taken from A Study of Decadence, when societies commit suicide. In China, when the Song dynasty was facing a barbarian invasion to their north from the Liao peoples, well, instead of funding or reforming the army to improve it, the Chinese composed poetry about how badly they wanted to reconquer the north. In China, there was a saying, just as good iron is not beaten into nails, a good man does not become a soldier. In other words, being an enlisted soldier was looked down upon as a job for losers. In India, the Rajas, kingdoms, built temples to please the gods to grant them victory, instead of taking on the tactics that made the Muslim conquerors so powerful or otherwise improving their militaries, allowing the Muslims, who they outnumbered 100 to 1, to conquer and rape northern India. Today, much of the modern left, particularly the social justice faction, dislike masculinity and try to remove it, are anti-police, and also have anti-military sentiments. In the modern left, it's looked down upon as immoral to become a police officer, soldier, hunter, or gun owner, while in medieval China, a man who becomes an enlisted soldier was looked down upon as letting his clan down. The modern left, college, university professors are their equivalent to medieval India's priest class, as with both pushing decadent mindsets and policies that killed their societies, with Democrat prosecutors and mayors who defund or otherwise refuse to support their own police forces and allowing rampant crime. I remind me of the Song dynasty, the emperors, who failed to fund or reform the Chinese army to improve it, which allowed the Liao people to conquer northern India. And the barbarians in leftist-controlled big cities, these would-be criminals. The commentator Decoy Voice has covered crime in left-wing controlled big cities, but would be militias in a civil war, while in Europe, the barbarians would be Russians. The mainstream left has alienated the military, alienated law enforcement, opposes weapons ownership, opposes masculinity, Any sense of duty and discipline is completely non-existent and completely pisses away moderates in an obsessive purity. Many leftists get frightened whenever I talk to them about weapons ownership to protect against tyranny, being terrified of death and pain, and many leftists retreated from Twitter after Twitter ceased to be a left-wing echo chamber after being taken over by Elon Musk. Medieval Indians hence thought that they could learn from no other societies, and even in speaking to non-Hindus would permanently pollute a person. Muslims who visited India before the Islamic conquests described the Indians as the most arrogant people they've ever met. Maybe that's why they went conquering. Many modern leftists seem to think that to speak with anyone means that you agree with them and just scream at you and block you if you challenge them. For example, Sargon of Akkad has been given an assortment of labels, such as Nazi, alt-right sympathizer, and many more for simply debating Richard Spencer. Ditto for Daryl Davis. There are recurring cycles, ups and downs, but the course of events is essentially the same, with small variations. It has been said that history repeats itself. This is perhaps not quite correct. It merely rhymes. Theodore Haruik. Talk about painting yourself into a corner. There's no block button for right-wing militias. I've lived my whole life in the South. I know what muscleheads are. You are not ready to deal with an army of 100 million muscleheads. Someone please explain to me, who's going to enforce gun laws when the police are defunded and you don't trust the military either? Never mind. Paint posse comitatus. Just as fiat currency is bullshit backed by aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, and cryptocurrency is bullshit backed up by fanatical nerds, gun control is bullshit backed up by police officers with guns, without said police officers with guns, or other government agents like soldiers, you have no real authority. I gotta admit, the Christian right is extremely masculine, know what their values and principles are disciplined, and are way more intelligent than you think. Take my word for it. It's common sense to never underestimate your opponent. We're getting to a point where the left thinks their opponents are Nazis, while the right thinks their opponents are groomers who are satanic heathens and thus deserve no rights whatsoever. If you want to know what war of religious fanatics looks like and what is required to fight them, look into the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. It isn't pretty. Part 4. Racism and social justice, and some other things I want to say. When it comes to racism, the vast majority of right-wingers I know aren't racist. Tribal and socially conservative, sure, but not racist. Rural people do tend to have stronger in-group preferences than city people, and prefer the outsiders pass the test or otherwise show themselves to be worthy of membership within their tribe, which is the local community. There are legitimate criticisms of immigration which aren't racist. I say that as someone who empathizes with immigrants. My own mother is an immigrant. I do think that conservatives are more predisposed towards prejudices, like prejudice is towards furries or atheists, which I believe isn't because they're irrationally bigoted, but rather primarily because they lack positive interactions with people outside of their tribe, and secondarily being lower in trait openness than social liberals. I've noticed how the social justice movement has taken off in 2014. I remember in 2012 and 2013 that the alternate media was on a strong upswing, and the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street movements were getting close to figuring out that the cooperation between big government and big corporations was the source for so many of our problems. Then 2014 came, and the social justice movement rose. I would attribute it largely to a handful of big corporations trying to get people to obsessively look for microaggressions rather than focus on corruption and influence in government. The same companies that talk about racism, sexism, and prejudice towards queers in the Anglophone world don't do the same in, say, China or Saudi Arabia. Likewise, say, Raytheon would rather have the left talk about trans issues rather than the fact that Raytheon's military hardware are used by the U.S. government in unjustifiable wars, and that Raytheon sells weaponry to imperialist human rights abusing states such as Israel and Saudi Arabia. What Occupy Wall Street protesters are upset about. Corporations have way too much power. What Tea Party members are upset about. Government has way too much power. Large corporations lobby for the government to have more power, and in return, the government enacts laws and regulations favorable to large corporations. This is talked about in The Blunt Truth about the Trayvon Martin case, and Dave Smith explains the origin of woke culture. The media will talk about dividing issues like abortion, how many genders there are, or other culture war issues rather than unifying issues such as corruption. The media is literally controlled by the CIA and military-industrial complex. Six corporations own 90% of the news media. Left-wingers then question authority. Left-wingers now question anyone questioning authority. Social justice people will obsess over petty stuff like microaggression or being called the wrong pronoun. Early in the monkeypox outbreak, many people were so politically correct that they split hairs to not call monkeypox a gay sexually transmitted disease. In my opinion, if they truly wanted to help gay men instead of virtue signal, they would advise gay men to wear condoms, not exchange bodily fluids, and get tested regularly, which everyone who's sexually active should do anyway if they aren't monogamous, as that there are many nasty STDs out there, some of them permanent. Monkeypox, for example, is definitely painful. So say seriously talking about Israel is out of the question. Let me demonstrate the difference between political correctness and true compassion. Opposing all circumcisions on children is compassion. Letting circumcisions happen because the parents making the decisions are members of minorities is political correctness. Opposing unjustifiable wars is compassion. Making excuses for otherwise unjustifiable wars because members of some social minority is involved is political correctness. Political correctness is cowardice. Cowardice that hurts everyone, both in the short term and long term. Also, the aforementioned cases are examples as to why we need to have clear values and principles. I expect social justice warriors to assume that I hate Chinese people, especially Jewish people, whenever I talk about the Chinese Communist Party or Israel and Zionists respectively. There are people who really think that you hate Chinese people if you criticize the CCP. I don't have the time to make a disclaimer every time I turn around. The people of Palestine, Syria, and the Western Middle East all sure as hell don't have time for me to make a racism disclaimer every time I try to talk about Israel. I sincerely don't want May and Miriam to get shit for the stuff that Yang and Eli are up to. Oceania and East Asia has always been at war with Eurasia. If someone accuses me of hating Jews, it would be hilarious. Some of my favorite people in politics are Jews. As you can see in my article, a few notable Jewish libertarians and allies of libertarians, along with this stripped-down version, notable Jewish anti-Zionists. A couple of individuals that might be of interest to you would be Robert Epstein, who's a teen rights advocate / youth rights advocate, and Eric Klopper, a researcher and anti-circumcision activist. For those of you who hate Jews, look at Imperial Japan in contrast with modern Japan. Imperial Japan was a pure monster. Its army and navy routinely abused and tortured prisoners of war, had soldiers who kill and rape civilians on a routine basis, committed the rape of Nanking, and conducted some of the cruelest human experiments in history. But Japan today is a pacifistic country with some of the best human rights records in Asia, rule of law, freedom of the press, and is one of the most loved nations in the world. If the isolated island nation of Japan can change, I think Israel and the Jewish people can too. The problem of never holding minorities accountable for what they do is talked about in the video, How Leftists Protect Extremists. I'm the one who's saying that we should judge people as individuals, not collectives as if they were Borg drones. Refer back to misunderstanding people is okay. If we're going to cancel people for having single flaw, then we'll have to cancel Socrates for being a pederast, Thomas Jefferson for owning slaves, Sigmund Freud for his theory of penis envy, Albert Einstein for having sex with his cousin, Gandhi for his racism and sexual behaviors, the unholy side of Gandhi, Penn and Teller was BS. Martin Luther King for being a womanizer, plagiarist, and homophobe. Richard Stallman was a commenter on pedophilia, plus eating something off his foot. Three of the aforementioned men are Jewish, and at least one is autistic. The above is partially inspired by alt-light, has more in common with MLK than SJW do. Don't let the holier-than-thou SJWs destroy our history. They are after who Jefferson now has predicted, and my thoughts on the Richard Stallman situation. Conversely, Hitler opposing smoking, supporting welfare, and being a vegetarian is not enough to make him a good person. Stalin's Soviet Union banning lobotomy does not change the reality of Stalin's Soviet Union and having one of the very worst human rights records in human history. New Jersey banning corporal punishment in both government and private schools does not change the reality that New Jersey is one of the most corrupt states in the Union, rife with organized crime. And Caleb Maupin, and speaking out against corporal punishment in American schools, does not make him any less of a tanky than John McCain opposing torture makes him any less of a neocon. You need to compartmentalize both the good and bad in people, and judge them by the totality of their actions. Why do I say that? Because I see the mainstream media cancel anti-war figures such as love them or hate them, Ron Paul and Tulsi Gabbard, either digging up something they said politically incorrect, or borderline defaming them while promoting politicians who have murdered hundreds of thousands of people in unnecessary wars. Like I said, of compartmentalizing, if I was to, say, talk to George Galloway about Israel, it does not make me a tanky any more than talking to David Duke about Israel makes me a racial determinist. I don't know why it seems that, by and large, leftists are more likely to smear and defame their opponents than right-wingers. It could be because left-wingers have a more utopia justifies the means, / the ends justifies the means mentality. Right-wingers have a stronger sense of honor. Right-wingers are better attached to reality, or a combination of the above factors. I expect left-wing atheists to drop the ball at talking to religious right-wingers like the Tibble twins pissing off Molly by screaming for ice cream in the Arthur episode, Mind Your Manners. Or alternately, in the movie Jarhead, when Swafford earned himself a demotion. When this war begins, and it will begin, I don't want you covering my ass. Staff Sergeant Skikes, United States Marine Corps. That's exactly how I feel with an overwhelming majority of left-wingers I've dealt with. If the Christian Taliban take control of America and turns America into a Puritan totalitarian theocracy, do not come crying to me about how centrists are conservatives who are fascists. Seriously, I know a popular left-wing YouTube channel that says just that. That same channel is a little tanky channel that has the audacity to call centrists fascists and tantamount to Nazis. Don't say I didn't warn you. Part 5. A case for cautious optimism. I do have cautious optimism for the moderates winning in the long term, or at least the Christian right take power, don't only briefly be in power. Oliver Cromwell did become dictator in England, but democracy returned after he died. France in the 1960s had Charles de Gaulle take over, reset the system, and return to democracy. Turkey had 2 military coup d'etat, 4 attempted coup d'etat, and 4 military memorandums in the latter half of the 20th century, avoided slipping into a totalitarian nightmare, rather be right-wing totalitarianism in the form of Islamic theocracy, or left-wing totalitarianism in the form of Marxism-Leninism. Egypt in 2012 and 2013 had the Muslim Brotherhood in power for approximately a year and was overthrown. In the Islamic world, many states declare Islam as a state religion, but the state is de facto secular, not imposing Sharia law outside of family law, such as Tunisia, Algeria, and to a lesser degree Morocco and Bangladesh. Countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Indonesia, except for Assad, and Turkey have secular governments, though non-religious people do face discrimination in Indonesia. Prostitution is legal in Turkey, Tunisia until 2022, Algeria, and Bangladesh. Many of the aforementioned countries are more collectivist and are more accepting of authoritarianism than America. However, what worries me about America is loneliness, which is largely caused by internet addiction, along with car dependency, reducing third places other than home and work, school, which, as mentioned above, loneliness can lead to totalitarianism. What could happen is that, after the Christian right seizes power, the rest of America's population create a coalition to remove them from power. Most American conservatives outside of the Bible Belt, called are libertarian, or at least moderate, and don't support Christian fundamentalism or extreme social conservatism. It's in our interest to not piss them off. Thank you for listening. Oh, I almost forgot. Links. Alternate media sources. Don't like the mainstream media. Here's some alternate media sites that I would recommend. Debate opportunities. America versus Europe and the world. And arguments against leftism. Alternate media starter pack. Corbett Report, Media Monarchy, Consortium News, Real Left, Glenn Greenwald, H.A. Goodman, a few of Ryan Dawson's videos against racism, alt-censored hood version. Ryan Dawson is not a racist, Odyssey version. Thank you for listening. Here's my social media link tree, which I ask that you keep archive. You keep the link and archive my content, and please to make sure that YouTube, Google does not monetize this video.
Listen, you son of a bitch. What the fuck's your problem? You want to sit here and say that I'm a goddamn fucking Russian? You get in my face with that, I'll beat your goddamn ass, you son of a bitch. You piece of shit. You fucking goddamn fucker. Listen, fuckhead, you have fucking crossed the line. Get that through your goddamn fucking head. Stop pushing your shit. You're the people that have fucked this country over and gang raped the shit out of it and lost an election. So stop shooting your mouth off claiming I'm the enemy. You got that, you goddamn son of a bitch? Fill your hand. I'm sorry, but I'm done. You start calling me a foreign agent, those are fucking fighting words. Excuse me.
Because as Google does not believe in free speech, along with its ties to BlackRock and Oracle. Oracle data mines info on billions of people, and BlackRock is crushing small businesses. Is to try to create a monopoly for itself. I don't want to give Google ad revenue.